Another day, another podcast. Appreciate y'all clicking on the video. My name is Cameron Buckner, and this is the Dixie Cryptid podcast. Let's jump right into these stories. I think you're going to enjoy this. All right, here we go. Here is an encounter story from Steve. I think you're going to like this. Back in 1979, when I was 9 years old, we lived in Angelina County in East Texas. It was about 20 miles south of Lovekin, near the Sam Rayburn Lake area. Both of my grandparents lived there. They were divorced but lived about 2 miles from each other. They each lived on a typical, modest farm of 25 to 30 acres with lots of chickens, ducks, horses, and cows. One smoldering summer night at my grandmother's farm, the adults were engaged in their usual routine of cooking dinner before settling in for a night of card playing. Meanwhile, I was slipping outside with my brother, who was 11, my cousin, who was 8, and my dad's 10-year-old brother, our uncle, to hang out at the edge of one of the pastures where the yard light on a pole made a bright circle in the night. Beyond that halo, the world was inky black. Within the light was the pasture gate where we liked to sit and use our slingshots to play sort of a gigantic game of marbles by shooting rocks out of the circle and into the night. We were all sitting up on the gate, engrossed in our game and cutting up and laughing as little boys will do, when our attention was suddenly drawn in the direction of the barn located 100 yards to our left. We silently stared and listened as something massive and heavy came running through the pasture from that direction. We shot looks at each other as we realized the speed at which this thing was running. We knew it was on 2 legs, and that brought another round of glances to one another. Every thump, thump, thump of those pounding steps burned itself into my mind as we sat waiting to see what this thing could be. It was at the edge of the light when it came to a complete stop, as if it had just then noticed us sitting there. The brightness ended so abruptly at the circle's edge that all we could see were 2 tree trunk-sized legs from the knees down. They were massive. We could tell they were covered with brown hair that looked like long, fine, brown wire. It was swaying like the hair on a wig moving in the wind. Then my uncle did something that surprised us all. He had a rock locked and loaded in his slingshot and chose that moment to fire it right at the creature. We knew it hit its mark by the thump it made when it hit the animal's body, followed by a plunk as it hit the ground at its feet. But what happened next was the craziest thing I'd ever seen in all my 9 years of living. The creature picked up the rock and threw it back at us, missing my head by inches. Instantly, as if the devil himself were chasing us, we sprang into action and sprinted for the house, pushing at and tripping over each other as we ran. It wasn't a matter of outrunning that thing in the darkness. We were trying to outrun each other. No one wanted to be the last man in line. There was no doubt in our minds that whichever poor soul came in last would go down first. We breathlessly burst through the door, screaming for our parents to come outside and dispatch the monster in the pasture, but they just laughed at us. They went back to their card game, certain we were making up the whole thing. There was nothing left for us to do. We weren't going back outside with an adult to get rid of the beast, so we cleaned up and we went to bed. But none of us slept that night knowing there was something out there. The next morning, my dad and my stepfather weren't at the breakfast table. We asked my grandmother where they were, and as soon as she told us they were out in the pasture, we ran out the front door to join them. We found them at the far end examining a piece of fence that had been ripped up and completely demolished as if something large had run right through it. My step-grandfather and dad were baffled by the damage. All the animals were accounted for. They couldn't imagine what had done this. Thank you for letting me share my story. I will be in touch with you about my other 4 encounters. Well, Steve, You better get those encounters in here if you hadn't already. I'm going to look for your name in my email list, and I'm going to try to find them because, brother, you can tell a good story. This was awesome. Oh, I could just see everything. These boys having a good time down in Texas on a hot summer night. Oh, man, what an adventure and what a story to tell years later. Steve, thank you very much for sending this. I'm speaking for everybody who heard this story. We loved it, and you did a good job on it. Thanks again, buddy. I appreciate you. Okay, one last story. Hey, before I get into this story, I got in trouble last night. I put out a podcast yesterday, and I spent 10 or 15 minutes talking about how great the Smoky Mountain Bigfoot Conference was. And apparently my wife listened to it and mentioned to me last night that you didn't even mention me. And I said, well, you really don't, you kind of like to be behind the scenes. I know, but I wanted you to tell everybody how nice they were and how much I appreciated them coming to talk to me. And my wife, April, says thank you to everyone that visited our booth and was so nice to her. She was the little, short, gray-headed girl in the middle between Neoma and Nance. If you guys didn't know who she was, I think a lot of people thought she was Neoma, and a lot of people thought Neoma was my wife, and a lot of people thought Nance was my wife. But no, it was the girl in the middle with the black T-shirt on and the totally gray hair, which I absolutely love. Heck, I'm just glad that woman likes me. I'm a lucky man. Okay, let's get into this story. This person wants to be anonymous. Here's what they write. My first encounter with what I respectfully call the old ones occurred in 1981 when I was 16 years old. I've always loved driving onto our farm and parking the truck and taking long hikes through the woods. On this occasion, I came to a Y intersection of two of our farm roads. I turned onto the left fork to get a drink from the spring 30 yards down the path. As I headed down to the ford, I noticed footprints. My first thought was, now who in the Thunder Nation is down here barefoot? And then I realized two things. First was the size. I've worn the same size, 11.5 shoes, since I was 12 years old. These prints were half again as big, easily 18 or 20. The second was the gait. From the heel of one print to the toe of the opposite print was nearly 6 feet. I followed them down to the water and stopped. They continued in the same unbroken gait up the opposite side and disappeared where the road leveled off again. I got my water and then debated whether or not to follow. My better judgment said no, and I returned to my trek back to the truck. In the ensuing years, there have been several incidents, particularly when walking out on an afternoon of deer hunting at what we call good dark. Several times when leaving my stand, I knew I was being followed. Whatever it was, it stayed far enough away to be disguised by the dusk, but close enough to be felt. I detected no hostility towards me, just its presence and an overwhelming sense of, you've had your fun and now it's time to leave. In January of 2013, I was 48 years old, married, and we had kids, and I was living and working 80 miles from my hometown. I had been to visit my mother and was driving back home as the daylight was just beginning to fade. As I rounded a curve, I saw about 100 yards in front of me a massive dark object crouched in the road, right on the double yellow line. It moved to my right about 30 feet in 3 steps and was against a brush line trying to blend in. I watched it in amazement. It was approximately 9 feet tall with at least 4-foot shoulder span. It was covered in dark hair and I estimated it to weigh around 900 pounds. Its face was very much like a gorilla. It was dark and leathery with a broad, flat nose. Its eyes were the most intense yellow-green I've ever seen and were spaced 6 inches apart. As I approached him, he threw his left arm across his chest as if to instinctively ward off a blow. I suppose he believed I was about to hit him, I rounded the curve and kept going, passing within 30 feet of him. By the spring of 2016, we had moved back to our hometown, and the kids were all familiar with my encounter. One Saturday afternoon in April or May, my youngest son came to the house, ashen and shaking all over. "I saw it, Dad. I really saw it," he exclaimed. I asked him what he had seen, and with eyes wide and full of wonder, he said, "I saw the Bigfoot." I asked him to show me where. So we went into the backyard and he showed me the tree the creature had peered around. We estimated it to be around 9 feet tall. We also found and took pictures of several very large footprints. And since then, my son has seen what he calls Rocky several times in the backyard. In February of last year, 2020, my friend Mike and I were in my backyard and found tracks. They came across the face of the tree line and stopped and then faced my house. They then turned and went into the bushes. After Mike left, I went inside and told my son and daughter about seeing the tracks. Without the least prompting, my son smiled and said, "Yeah, I saw Rocky yesterday. I was playing in the side yard and bent over to pick up a stick, and as I stood up, there were 2 fur-covered tree trunks in front of me. When I straightened up, there was Rocky facing me 20 feet away. He chuffed at me and stepped into the bushes." Well, I was amazed. I had gotten into my story only far enough to say Mike and I found tracks. He had described what we had seen to the last detail. Mike and I have been chuffed at several times on the farm. In March, we had a visual of what I believe to be a mated couple on the shoreline of a large pond. Within a few yards of where they were standing, we found 2 bedding sites where they had slept. A few weeks later, we had another sighting of the same pair about a quarter-mile away, standing in a tree line watching us. It's now mid-June, and I must admit, I'd like to see them again. I'd like to see them soon. Well, I don't blame you. There I go, I'm wanting to say his name again. I don't blame you at all for wanting to see him again. If I saw one around my place, I would want to see it all the time. I would want to kind of develop a relationship and not habituate it, because I've been told that's a bad thing to do. But I would love to see it and kind of maybe know they're living here and know that we live in peace and that I don't encroach on their food supply, etc., and they don't encroach on mine, and we can live in peace. But I don't blame you for wanting to see one again. But that was a great story. That's a long story. It goes back to when he was 16 years old, and now he's 48. Well, he was 48 in 2013, so he's probably, he's pushing 60. He's about my age. Anyway, great story. Thank you for sending it, sir. I really appreciate it. All right. The man wants to be anonymous, but it's a story about the Boggy Creek, the Fouke area. I always love these stories, and I love it when people send these in, because the legend of Boggy Creek is the catalyst that put so many people on the trail of Bigfoot and interested in Bigfoot. It's still today, it's an iconic movie, but this is a Fouke, Arkansas story. Miller County is located in the southwest corner of Arkansas. Its county seat is Texarkana, but it is perhaps most famous for the tiny town that lies less than 20 miles to the south, known as Fouke. My family has lived in Miller County since before the Civil War. I lived in Fouke for most of my young life. We were not in the camp of believers in the Fouke monster made famous by the movie The Legend of Boggy Creek. It may come as a surprise to many, but not everyone in that region believes. Sometime in 1981 or 1982, I was around 14 years old, and something happened that in recent years has made me question my family's position. In the fall, I had invited a friend from school to spend the weekend with me to scout deer hunting places for the upcoming deer season. Our house was surrounded by 50 acres of standing hardwood timber with a large creek running through it. Beyond that timber was a large cutover of 400 acres or more. It seemed to go on forever. That day, we had walked all the way across that land looking for deer sign when we came up on an odor so powerful and so bad, I told my friend I didn't want to find the source of it. I assumed it was a dead horse or some other large animal decomposing in the hot Arkansas sun. It smelled like a cross between rotten meat, trash, raw sewage, and a heavy dose of strong sulfur, similar in intensity to a skunk, but different. It hung so thick in the air that we could almost taste it. We decided it was time to go home, and we turned to head back. It was getting dark, but we followed the logging roads that ran in straight lines between the properties. As we walked along with our timber to our right, the cutover to our left, and the setting sun sinking in the sky behind us, we became aware of something paralleling us in the timber beside the cutover. We couldn't see anything in the failing light, but it sounded like it was on 2 feet and that it was fairly close. I called out to it, but it didn't get a response. A quarter mile up the road, we turned right along the property line. As a result, whatever was following us was now silhouetted against the sun. "Did you see that?" my friend cried. He was so upset he couldn't stop blubbering and wringing his hands. I hadn't seen anything, so he pointed into the woods and he said, "Look right there." At the bottom of a large oak tree, I could see a shadow about 3 feet off the ground peering back at us. It was all black, made even more so by the sun behind it, so I couldn't make out any features. I did note, however, that it didn't have any ears on top of its head, and I thought that was strange. If it had been a dog or a coyote, I would have expected to see ears. But since I didn't believe in the legend, I decided it was nothing to be worried about. By now, my friend was having a nervous breakdown. He started begging me to start running. He wanted to get away from there. "My family's lived here for generations," I assured him. "There's nothing to worry about. There's nothing here that can hurt you." But he was not impressed. We still had 50 acres of timber to walk through, and the sun was disappearing fast. As it vanished beyond the horizon, darkness swallowed the woods, leaving us unable to move forward until the sodium light came on in the yard so I could find the house. We moved slowly towards home, and that thing in the woods stayed behind us within 50 feet the entire time. Even though we had nothing more than a couple of pellet guns, I was never afraid. It had to be some sort of animal, but nothing to be concerned with. Finally, we got back to the house and were safely in the kitchen where my friend lost his mind. He called his folks to come get him. They showed up and put him in the floorboard of the car and covered him with a blanket. He was a basket case. The next Monday, he went to school and told everyone that we had seen the Fouke monster. People asked me what I saw, and I said it was something small behind a tree, nothing to be afraid of. The kid quit speaking to me after that. A few days later, he moved to a different school. I wouldn't see him for another 6 years when we ran into each other in college history class. And after all that time, he still would not speak to me. Over 2 decades passed before I gave it another thought. I was watching an episode of Finding Bigfoot where the witness described an incident that was the same basic story I just related. The biggest difference was that this person's encounter happened to be in Utah. What he had seen poking out from behind a tree were the creature's knees. I sat straight up in my chair as the hair stood up on the back of my neck. I was immediately back in that cutover with that kid. Did he see more than I did? I can't say I saw a Bigfoot, and I'm not sure what else it could be or what could explain it. Well, I want to keep wanting to say his name because he's got a good name. He's got a good Southern name, but I won't say his name. But I wonder if there's any way to get in touch with this guy and maybe shake his hand and say, "Hey, let's bury the hatchet. I think maybe you did see something." I don't know, but I understand exactly what this writer's saying. I mean, if I was out in the woods and somebody said, "Hey, I saw something," I'd say, "Oh, you didn't see nothing? Come on, let's keep going." I'm that way. I'm one of these people that likes to dismiss things that I encounter that are strange out in the woods because I always It kind of depends on who the person is, I think. If it was my wife, I would say, oh, that's nothing, come on. I mean, if she hears a little scratching in the house, she thinks a mouse is in the house. We live in the country, and mice are just a fact of life out here. Our house is not covered up with them except in the winter. But it's summertime, and we actually she saw a mouse run across the handrail on the back porch. So she's freaking out. And I'm like, don't worry about it. They need a place to stay too, and I'm going to have to get rid of them all. But you get my point. You kind of dismiss these things and you don't think anything else about it. It's not something that's ever on your mind, but it's on the other person's mind, and they get mad at you for it. And yeah, my wife gets mad at me when I dismiss her about the mice. So I can see both sides of this. One way or another, this was a great story, and the guy wrote it just perfectly, and I really appreciate it. It was a great story, and again, I love these foul monster stories. And it was so nice of him to send it in, and I really appreciate him. Thanks for joining me on this video and podcast. I really appreciate you, and we'll see you guys on the next one. Love you all. Talk to you soon. Thanks.
It's closing time. The bar is almost empty. It's me, the bartender, and the piano man.